Good afternoon, everybody. Wednesday's lesson was about the crushing of the radical left from November 1918 through until the first half of 1919. That was the second of two lessons. We didn't quite get to the very end, did we? I said that the final strand we just needed to finish off, and it's actually quite an important strand. So rather than rush it and just leave it for you to finish off by yourself at home, I did say that I'd finish that lesson off with just a quick YouTube video, just to make sure you understand the sort of key points. So if you can get your mind map out from last lesson and just go and have your notes ready and just finish it off. Okay, so we're looking at this sort of it's a question really, a debate. Historians have often called the events that we've been looking at for the last 2 or 3 lessons, they've called it the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. And we're in a sense putting a question mark at the end of those words, which means, is that the right term? Is that the way we should be describing these events? Was it a revolution, or could you argue that it actually wasn't a revolution? Okay, so I'm going to just move myself out of the way, get back to our original slideshow. We actually reached slide number 35 out of 45 slides, so I'm not going to take you blow by blow through the whole slideshow again. We've done 2 lessons on this. Actually, I just wanted to say something about this first picture. I'll just make myself a little bit smaller there. Hopefully now that makes sense to you. Didn't actually comment on it at the beginning because it wouldn't have made sense to you, but hopefully now you can understand who is shown in that cartoon. And of course it is the Eber-Groener Pact. There's Eber, cartoon of him on the left, and Groener, General Groener on the right, and of course making that deal. Of course, as I said, I think the pact actually, they were not face-to-face, it was actually a telephone call, the actual agreement that was made. But that's an original cartoon from the time, so it's quite a useful cartoon. So let's move on. I'll just whiz through the slides up to the point that we reached, just bear with me, and then we'll finish off the lesson. And you'd be pleased to see you don't have to look at me beyond that opening slide. Okay, so that's the point that we reached last lesson. Kind of like encompasses everything that we've covered in the last 2 lessons. So we looked at the way in which, in a sense, we know as historians that the empire did end in November 1918 and that Germany did become a republic in 1919, and it was later called the Weimar Republic. But it was an accidental decision, in a sense. That was Scheidemann standing on the balcony and making that statement, and in a sense there was no kind of like backing out of that. Once it had been said, it had been said. And then we looked at how Friedrich Eber, the leader of the SPD, his deputy leader was Scheidemann, made that crucial decision that rather than work with the radical left wing, Eber chose to turn against them. Okay, even though Eber was a socialist, he chose to side with the old order, the conservative elites, to crush the extreme left-wing revolutionary groups, in particular the Spartacists, who were trying to sort of like get an influence and trying to take control over these working class councils that were called Soviets, who ultimately wanted to seize power in Germany. And Eber, as a moderate socialist, felt that was wrong, and he made the crucial decision to side with the political right wing against that. And Hebert also kind of made an equivalent agreement, but in economic matters, that was called the Stinners-Legian Agreement, that was an agreement for the employers, the businessmen, represented by Stinners, to enter into conversations with the trade unions, represented by Legian, to work together in terms of labour relations in the workplace. And again, that was an attempt to sort of like ensure that the radical left wing didn't take control over the agenda. Okay. And then we looked at how these demobilised soldiers from the fighting front came back to Germany, and many of them were radicalised. They were extreme, but they were extreme on the far right. They had been indoctrinated with right-wing ideas that had come from the Fatherland Party and that had come from Ludendorff with the stab in the back. And they were driven by hatred of the radical left. So they will be the groups that will effectively now work with General Groener and Hebert to crush the radical left wing. And of course, that is then what happened as we moved into January 1919. Luxemburg and Liebknecht, the leaders of the Spartacists, sensing that they were losing control, decided to try to push the agenda forward, and so they made a poorly organised attempt to seize power in Berlin, following the example of what Lenin and the radical left had done in Russia a year earlier when they had seized power of the capital of Russia and turned Russia into a communist state. And of course the Spartacists, to sort of exemplify that, changed their name to the German Communist Party. But it was a badly organised attempt to take power of the capital city, and by that point, of course, the Freikorps had returned from the trenches. They were back in Berlin, and Hebert and Groener utilised the Freikorps to put down the Spartacists, and so Liebknecht and Luxemburg were murdered. And I think we finished off by saying that there were sporadic further attempts in other cities over the next few months for almost copycat attempts by the Spartacists, now renamed as the Communists, to try to take power in other cities. For example, in Bavaria that happened. But in every single case, the Freikorps were able to work with the army, with Groener, to crush those attempts to take power. So in a sense, the Hebert-Groener Pact had succeeded, okay, in crushing the radical left. So those were the events, okay, and it's now that key question: why do historians call it a revolution? And as you can see with your mind mapping, there are arguments about why. There's a good case. I mean, for the best part of 100 years since these events happened, because they happened just over 100 years ago, the history books the chapters have called it the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. But equally, there's an argument against that view, okay? That is, in a sense, a bit of a false name. It's a misleading name. It kind of implies something that didn't actually happen, okay? So we need to look at the other argument, and then just make sure we've got a handle about why what Hebert did is important, okay? So let's just go through then the final points. So there's our three strands, okay, that I've just said. Argue a case that the events were revolutionary. Can you then present an opposing argument, what we call a counter-argument, that the events were not revolutionary? And bottom line is, why is there controversy? Why is there debate amongst historians about Hebert's role in these events? So in a nutshell, So in the 100 years or so since these really remarkable and highly important events, historians have often described these events as a revolution. Okay, so they've often described it as a revolution. So you look at the history books, and the chapters will often call it the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. But many historians, especially in recent years, now argue that, in a sense, is a very simplistic title. It's a bit misleading. Yes, in some ways, what happened and the events that you have been learning about, they were revolutionary. Okay, so what are the arguments that would say it was a revolution? Well, for example, now remember, a revolution, and we'll look at a definition in a moment, okay? But put in a fairly simplistic way, a revolution is a significant change that has a huge impact on the lives of everybody, okay? A massive change. And of course, what has happened is it's not just a change of government, okay? So, I mean, for example, you think of Britain today, we have a general election every four or 5 years, and that results in a change of government, okay? In other words, the political party running the country may change. That's not a revolution, okay? That's just simply a change of government, okay? Because although governments come and go and change, Britain has been a constitutional monarchy for hundreds of years, okay? So in Britain, we have a queen as our head of state, and we have a parliamentary democracy that sits beneath the queen. So that's why we would call it a sort of a constitutional monarchy, okay? It's a democratic system, but with a monarch above it. So just because the Prime Minister changes and the ruling party changes does not make it a revolution. But if basically there was a huge movement in Britain today to get rid of the monarchy, and the Queen stepped down and the whole of the House of Windsor said we don't want to be the monarchs anymore, and then suddenly it was decided that Britain is a republic, that instead of the Queen we have an elected president that replaces the Queen as head of state, then arguably that would be a revolution, because what has changed there is not the government but the political system. Okay? So I've just used that as an example. And that's kind of what the argument is as to why the events of 1918 to 1919 in Germany were a revolution, because the argument is the monarchy has now ended. The Kaiser has abdicated, and not just the Kaiser who is the Emperor of Germany, but also, remember, the monarchs of the separate German Länder. In other words, remember the German word Länder, L-A-N-D-E-R, A with an umlaut on it, means states. So the King of Bavaria has gone, the Duke of Saxony has gone, and so on and so forth. All of the separate monarchs, the ruling families, the royal families have gone. Okay? And so it's not just the fact that Germany has been a republic, but the separate states that make up Germany have likewise shed their monarchs. Okay? So arguably that is a huge and significant change, which is therefore why we call it the Revolution of 1918 to 1919. Germany was now a republic, and remember, a republic means that there is no longer a head of state who is a monarch, and a monarch is somebody who gets their power by birth, okay, passed on by their bloodline. Instead, now you're going to have a head of state. Now, they haven't quite worked out in Germany yet as to how that head of state is going to be chosen, but that will be the job of the Constituent Assembly that will meet in January 1919 once it has been elected. So effectively, full power has now been given to the national parliament, okay, that had stepped in once the Kaiser had abdicated. Now that power has gone over to the Reichstag, So that's the main argument as to why Germany, as to why these events were a revolution. Okay, but on the other hand, there is a counter-argument. And a counter-argument is when a group of historians would actually challenge that, and these other historians would argue back that actually it wasn't a real revolution. And the reason they would say this is because beneath the surface, much had not changed. Okay? Now, there's a word for that. The opposite of change is continuity. Okay? It's an important word in history. Sorry, I haven't got a tablet pen. I'm just using my finger. But I'll just write that for you. Okay? Continuity. Okay? And continuity is when behind the scenes, although there might be change on the surface, a lot of things just continue as they were before. And these historians would argue that actually, significantly, some really significant things did not change. Okay? And these historians would actually argue we've got to compare Germany to Russia. Okay? Now, in Russia, that was a genuine revolution. Okay, so again, let's just go back to the underlining. So Russia, as we saw a year earlier, the communists, the extreme left, had brought about a complete change. Yes, the Russian emperor, Nicholas II, had abdicated, but it was more than just a change at the top. In Russia, there was a full change of the whole system. Okay, so in Russia, the Soviets had taken power. The working classes had taken power. There was a change at every level of the pyramid. And effectively in Russia, the middle classes were eradicated. Okay, they were taken out of the equation. Full power was taken away from the middle classes and was given to the working classes. But in Germany, that did not happen. In Germany, the extreme left wing, the Spartacists, had been crushed. The Soviets didn't take power. Okay, these working class councils, they did not take power. In Russia, a year earlier, they did. The communists infiltrated the Soviets, and the Soviets then stepped in and took over the running of Russia, and everything was changed. Okay, whereas in Germany that never happened. The only change that happened was at the very, very top. Okay, in which the Kaiser and the other monarchs were removed. But beneath that top level of the pyramid, things basically continued as before. So, this is why the Eber-Groener Pact is so important. As you know, Eber, the leader of the government, the temporary caretaker leader of the government, had made that deal with the old order. And that deal was that if, in return for the army, the old order, helping him crush the far left, the deal was, don't you worry, you will continue to keep your jobs that you've always had in the old Germany. Now remember, how many times have we mentioned this? In the old Germany, in the Second Reich, in the Kaiserreich, whatever you want to call it, in the German Empire that Bismarck had created, the Junkers, the upper classes, dominated the top jobs in the empire. They controlled the German army. They had the top jobs in the German civil service. They controlled the German judiciary, in other words, the law courts, the lawyers, the judges, and they controlled the top jobs in education. Okay? Now again, I'm switching backwards and forwards between countries here. Now let's go to Russia. When Lenin and the communists in Russia seized power in 1917, in October 1917, a year earlier, not only was the Russian Emperor Nicholas II removed, and he abdicated, but he was then, and his whole family were basically murdered. But Lenin and the Bolsheviks brought about a complete removal of everybody, of all the old order from positions of influence in Russia. Okay, so in Russia, the Russian nobility, the Russian upper classes who had controlled the Russian army and the top jobs in the Russian civil service and judiciary, etc., they lost all their jobs. Okay. Lenin abolished the Russian parliament. He gave full power to the workers' councils. Okay, he effectively abolished the Russian army, and he built a brand new army from scratch called the People's Army. Okay, and that brand new army, he deliberately called it the Red Army. It was an army of armed working class men. So there was a complete removal of what we call the old establishment. Okay, the establishment is the permanent structures that keeps law and order in a country. Lenin and the communists abolished everything, okay, and rebuilt the country from scratch, giving the working classes, the revolutionaries, the followers of the Communist Party, all of the key positions really in the new Russia that was created. He even changed the name of the country to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Okay, there was that much change in Russia. Now, you crossed then the border to Germany a year later in 1918 to 1919, and you asked that question: was there that type of that extent of change in Germany? No. Yes. Like in Russia, the emperor has gone, but that was really arguably about it. Really, the Eberg-Gröner Pact was a deal. Okay, we'll accept the fact that the emperor's gone, we'll call Germany a republic, but beyond that, it will be the same old Germany. Okay, so in this sense, the new republic was arguably the old empire, but dressed up to look a bit different. And arguably, calling it a revolution kind of implies that there was a massive fundamental change happening. Okay? But actually, it was window dressing change. Okay? And you think about why that was. Do you remember? It was the end of the war. Ludendorff wanted to basically just kind of like wipe his hands. He didn't want the monarchs and the upper classes to kind of like be associated with the embarrassing defeat. So he kind of like shoved responsibility over to the Reichstag. And then Hebert, as the leader of the Reichstag, made a deal with the old order. You can keep your jobs as long as you help me crush the extreme left. And of course, that was the deal. So apart from the fact that the Kaiser and the monarchs have lost their positions, beneath that, all the other upper classes kept their jobs. The army did not really change. The civil service, top levels, will continue to be controlled with the same old families. There really wasn't that much change beneath the surface. Okay, you can't really call it a social revolution. So that's it in a nutshell. Now, there's as I say, I've referred you to, and you've got the scan. So make sure, please, that you download and you print off Chapter 1 from Stephen J. Lee's second book, the one called The Weimar Republic. It's got the background, pages 101, the pages 1 to 2, kind of like give you a narrative of what happened. That'll be good just to sort of like consolidate your understanding. The first essay is very much about Germany during World War One, and that talks about the Bergfriede and the peace resolution and Erzberger and all the things we've been learning about. And then the second essay is an exploration of this debate. It's Stephen J. Lee writing basically an essay and weighing the arguments. Now, it's much more detailed than this particular video, and I have recorded a video in which I walk and talk you through the key points from Stephen J. Lee. And that video is 19 minutes long, and you can access that video if you download this slideshow, and you can click on that link, it takes you straight to the video. Or you can go to my playlist, and it's Germany 1914 to 1919, and you'll find the video in that particular playlist on my YouTube channel. Okay, so that's just a reminder for you. Okay, and so there's the playlists and the playlist. I'm just having a look at it. Yeah, it's that one there. Okay, it's there. Okay, Germany 1914 to 1919. Okay, and there's just a scan of my notes. Okay, so make sure you follow up by playing that particular video. And I just wanted to put this opening slide because because Stephen J. Lee begins his essay by defining that word revolution, and that's a sort of good approach. If you get an essay question at A level where you're asked, for example, was there a German revolution 1918 to 1919, well, a great way to begin the essay in your introduction is to define that word, is to lay out the definition. And he defines the word revolution as follows. He says a revolution is firstly, there's a transfer of power, okay, outside the normal constitutional process. Now that's the point I've made. If there's just a transfer of power within the normal constitution, so for example, I don't know, there's a change of election, let's say Boris Johnson and the Conservatives get voted out of power and the Labour Party under Keir Starmer then win the election, that's a transfer of power within normal process, okay? But a revolution would be kind of like a change of the system, like abolishing the monarchy, something like that, okay? That would have been a revolution, okay? So that's the first strand of it, okay? So secondly, radical changes to political infrastructure, okay? So again, think about that. That's pretty much what I've just said in terms of beneath the government, you've got the machinery of government. Sometimes we call it the establishment, the kind of like the machines that make the country work. And by that I mean things like the army, the civil service, the education system, okay, the judiciary, the law courts. Now, in Russia, Lenin basically completely overhauled all of that machinery and had it replaced by Communist Party organisations who took over all those things, even down to the army. A new army was built based on the workers. Okay, none of that happened in Germany. Okay, but the word radical, remember, means an extreme change. And so when we talk about the political infrastructure, we're talking about not the kind of government, because the governments come and go with elections, but we're talking about the fixed machinery, like the education system. Okay, so you know, I'm a head teacher of a secondary school. I'm part of the infrastructure for our country. When there's a general election, if Boris Johnson and the Conservatives were voted out and Keir Starmer and the Labour Party were voted in, I wouldn't lose my job. They don't change all the jobs in the schools because there's a new political party running the country. That's what I mean. Whereas a radical change would remove all the jobs, okay, and change the sort of like the way in which the infrastructure works, okay, new people running the infrastructure. And then the third way that Lee defines the revolution is, he says, is that the process of revolution is often, not always, brought about by war, and that war will often kind of like speed up change and will bring about revolution, okay, and make it happen. And so on that particular basis, he uses those three definitions as a way of measuring, was there a revolution in Germany? Now, I suppose that first one, you could say war played a big part in accelerating the events, and it brought about the abdication of the Kaiser. But Was there a radical change to the political structure? Not really. Yes, the Kaiser has gone, the monarchs have gone, but the civil service and the army continued unchanged. Okay, so that, I suppose, the middle one is where the debate was. Was there a transfer of power outside normal constitutional process? Well, partly. The Kaiser has gone. Okay, that is a big change, but really massive change of power. The Reichstag still continued as normal. Okay, so hopefully you can sort of understand why there's debate. So the detail then, just to finish this off, so you got those question 1, question 2, question 3. So here's the answer to question 1. On one level, the events of January to August 1919 were revolutionary because they did help bring about some significant political change. Okay, so the Kaiser and the monarchs who ruled the separate German states have all abdicated. The Second Reich has been replaced by a republic, and the new Germany will be ruled by a new civilian government that will hold power through an elected Reichstag. Okay, and then thirdly, there have been significant gains made by the lower classes. Okay, they certainly have achieved. So, for example, the Stinners-Legian agreement has given them the 8-hour working day. So you could argue that was a big change, a revolution, a huge change. So those are all arguments. But on another level, though, it's questionable how far the events were really revolutionary. So by August 1919, by the summer of 1919, the revolutionaries have been crushed. Spartacists were crushed. Copycat communist uprisings in other parts of Germany were crushed. Bavaria had become a Soviet republic briefly, but that was crushed. Okay, so really the revolutionaries did not win, they were defeated. Okay, which is in contrast to Russia, where the communists did win. Secondly, Hebert, backed by the Freikorps, had absolutely ensured that the Soviets would play no further part in government. Okay, so the workers' councils have been crushed. Okay, the real changes, okay, such as, remember the October reforms? Prince Max had worked it out with the Kaiser in October 1918. As I said, we will have a much fairer voting system. We'll get rid of the 3-tier voting system. Well, those changes happened before the revolutionary events of January 1919. They had been agreed before the Kaiser even abdicated. So, in a sense, to argue that it was a revolution because now the voting system was fairer, well, that actually was not, that change didn't happen as a result of the revolutionary action. It happened because it was decided by Prince Max. Okay, so it's debatable whether that was a revolution. And then critically, the military leadership was unchanged. And you could say the same for the civil service, you could say the same for the judiciary, you could say the same for the education system. The old Prussian elites, the upper classes of Prussia, the big farmers who lived to the east, who had dominated the machinery of government ever since 1871, continued to keep their jobs. And again, crucially, those elites had no belief in democracy or no real respect for the new SPD government. They've said to Hebert, yes, you can run Germany, but the only reason they've given power to Hebert is because they don't want to be associated with the horrible, unpleasant job that Hebert's now got to do, and that is to go to Paris and sign a peace treaty that's going to humiliate this defeated Germany. These people who dominate, who've kept hold of their jobs, the Prussian elites, have in a sense given power to the Social Democrats because they want them to sort of like carry the smell of defeat. They don't want to have it associated with them. Okay? So Hebert has sort of like relied on an army that is fundamentally not a believer in democracy. And that reliance, even though the new Germany is now supposedly a very democratic country, the machinery of this new Germany, in other words, the army and the civil service, is going to be controlled by a class of people, the upper classes, who do not believe in democracy. And so fundamentally, this new republic, this new democratic Germany that was born in 1919, with a lot of hoo-ha about the fact Germany has now become democratic, was actually propped up by institutions like the army and the civil service that could not stand the idea of democracy. So that fundamentally weakened the republic the moment that it was born. Okay? So Hebert could therefore, at very best, from now on, even though Hebert is now the new leader of Germany, I mean, he is the democratically elected person. It's a huge change. Power now lies from below. Germany is going to be governed by an elected party. The SPD is the largest party in the Reichstag. Hebert, at best, can only rely on the lukewarm support of the army in future years. At worst, and critically, now that the army leadership has crushed the radical left, their job is to make the new Germany work, but actually they despise the system that has now taken power. The army, at heart, would rather Germany continued to be run by the Kaiser, but they have made a deal to accept the fact that the Kaiser goes and that the new Germany be a much more democratic system. Okay, so that's fundamentally going to weaken the new Germany moving forward. And even more critically, Hebert has relied on these Freikorps, ex-soldiers who cannot stand the concept of freedom and democracy, and has relied on them to put down the far left. Okay, so Hebert's in a very, very difficult position. He fundamentally believes in democracy, he believes in law and order, he believes that power should now lie with democratically elected representatives, in other words, with the Reichstag. A deal has been made that has, with a Groener, that basically says, that recognises, yes, the new Germany will be democratic and the power will from now on lie with the representatives of the ordinary people. But remember, that was kind of like a deal that was forced on the German army, because Woodrow Wilson, the American president, had said, well, I won't accept a peace treaty, I will not accept any peace terms unless you agree that Germany becomes a democracy. So this man Hebert that we're looking at here is a fundamental believer in democracy, but the people who he's dependent upon to make this new system work have basically given him the job to do, but they fundamentally do not really back the system that they have put into power. So that's kind of like the situation. Now the controversy, arguably Hebert did what was necessary. Yeah, you can almost sort of feel sorry for him. He was there stuck in the middle, and Hebert had turned, as we've seen, to this group to overthrow that group. And Hebert was stuck in the middle, okay? And a deal had been made by Hebert, okay, to sort of preserve law and order. But the big debate is, did he really do what was necessary? It could be argued that he overreacted to a non-existent threat, okay? Because this group here, the Spartacists, The whole assumption was that Hebert made, this man here, he made the assumption that the Spartacists on the extreme left were a genuine threat, that they were capable and they had the power and the support to overthrow the government in Berlin. And that's what he was worried about. And you can understand where Hebert was coming from, because Hebert was very aware of what had happened in Russia a year earlier. Okay? And Lenin and the Bolsheviks, fair credit to them, had succeeded. They had taken control of Petrograd. They were a revolutionary group. They had overthrown the government in Petrograd and declared that Russia now was a communist state. And Hebert was worried that the Spartacists were going to do the same in Germany, that they were going to seize power in Berlin and declare Germany to be a communist state. But actually, all the evidence is that the Spartacists were very, very disorganised, and that they had not really got any power base. They hadn't really got their message through to the Soviets. There was disagreement between Liebknecht and Luxemburg about the timing. And in the end, they kind of like hastily planned a takeover of Berlin, and they barely held power in Berlin for more than just 3 or 4 days before ultimately the Freikorps removed them. So the argument is, this man Hebert, did he really need to make a deal with Groener to crush these groups on the left? He could perhaps have just brought about an end to the Freikorps, just reliant on local troops in Berlin to sort of crush it, rather than have to sort of like make this deal with Groener that said, you guys can keep all your top jobs in the future. Okay, so the argument is that Hebert, in a sense, overreacted to a non-existent threat. Okay, that's sort of one of the key points. And in that sense, the historians have pushed the point that if he overreacted to the threat from the left, in a sense, did he betray socialism? Because his party, the SPD, should have been there, as you can see. They were part and parcel of, I mean, they had a lot in common with the radical left. Shouldn't Hebert have actually talked to the Spartacists and worked out an agreement with them? Was there a need for him to crush them and overreact the way they did? Okay, and that's kind of like the controversy really about Hebert's role in these events. So there you go, there's the finished picture that we've mapped out for these 2 lessons, all in a nutshell in one mind map for you. There's a source, have a look at the source. We're going to be doing a lesson soon about how to answer the source questions, and as I've said to you already, don't ignore these sources that sit at the back of the notes, read them. And here what I've done is I'm actually giving you a few question prompts, because it's Liebknecht's speech at a majority SPD and an independent USPD meeting on the 10th of November 1918, and I've asked a few little prompts there, which I would hope that you would now be able to make sense of that speech. So read that speech and map those points onto that mind map, okay? And we're going to be moving into how to answer source questions fairly soon. And there's the speech, okay? Next lesson then, we will do the birth of the Weimar Republic, pages 101 to 104 of the textbook. Read that, think about the following, okay? So we've talked about the Constituent Assembly. Hebert deliberately said, we can't make any decisions until there's been a proper election. All Germans have an equal vote, form a special Reichstag, a special national parliament, whose job is to draw up a new constitution. Therefore, we call it the Constituent Assembly. Look at the divisions within the new republic, the opening of the assembly, and then we'll talk about the economic problems that the new Germany faced in 1919. And then, of course, Hebert had to send representatives. He actually sent Erzberger, who we've already mentioned, and Walter Rathenau to Paris to sign the agreement of the 28th of June 1919. And then we will think about the strengths versus the weaknesses of the new republic that was created in 1919. So that's what we'll do next lesson. So make sure you've done some basic reading on that before Wednesday's lesson. And that is it. Okay, hopefully that's clear to you. Thanks very much. As always, if you've got any questions, just post a message on chat in Teams. Thanks very much.